can be considered art and what can't be considered art. I mean, if we look at AI and we type in something, for example, I want to draw this picture or whatever the case may be, and it evokes a response, do we consider that good art because it was created by a machine, or do we accept that it is still art because the machine was created by a person and that person behind it has formulated its ability to create such art? Hey guys, Storm Cecile here, and this video is all about what drives people to create. Now, before we get into the video, I have my artifact of the week, which is right behind me, and it is a piece of scripture from, I believe, the period 1604, but it has Esther chapter 3 and Esther chapter 4, and I think my favorite part of that, I suppose, that piece of scripture is Esther chapter 4 verse 1-4, which says, "Who knows, perhaps you were born for such a time as this." I think as artists, we are born into a particular time to make impact. I think often artists are overlooked and not respected sometimes, which is unfortunate, because I think we offer so much to the world. We challenge culture. And I actually saw something on a building at a university. I can't remember which university it was, but it said that essentially artists are the legislators before the legislators, which I think is true. I think we inform culture often a lot of time before, I suppose, law does that. Often the things that we see passed into law are things that are expressed through the arts and expressed through what people are thinking about. Because art has that emotional pull, it means that people can actually connect with it in one way or another before it actually goes into legislation. But it leads me perfectly into the topic of what drives people to create. Earlier this year, I had a toothache, and this is going to sound so minimal and trivial, but when I tell you, this was literally one of the worst toothaches. I don't even think I've ever had a toothache before this. Honestly, I cannot count them as toothaches because it was nothing. And I've heard that giving birth can actually be easier than having a toothache. And in that moment, truth be told, I do not have the evidence for that. I have never given birth. But I think in that moment, I probably would have traded places because it was that painful. But anyway, during that time, I started creating multiple things. I made rugs, I went to a candle making workshop, I was making pasta and all sorts of stuff. And I found myself in love with creation, which is why I got into this topic, what drives us to create. And at the time I was creating all of these things, it was not to challenge culture, it was not to, make a statement or to be controversial or to make a point or anything like that. It was simply out of a desire. I wanted to create because I wanted to express myself. But interestingly, when I looked at the definition of art in and of itself, art is about human skill and imagination, and it's appreciated usually for its emotional pull and power. And so even though I wasn't bringing anyone into my process, I wasn't necessarily sharing my poems or the rug making or the pasta necessarily with anyone in particular, it did have an emotional pull and power over me, which I suppose means it fulfilled its function as to why we create and also what makes good art. I suppose by virtue, in order to have good art, it must be pulled from the definition in some sort of way. But then I also think there are other mediums and modes for what makes good art. For example, form. If you have good form and you can master the elements and principles of art, then that is good art. If art can imitate, I suppose, the general culture or what we're seeing in real life, that is good art. I mean, when you see art where quite literally you cannot tell the difference between it being real or fake. Like, there's that show on Netflix which is about cake or not cake, and you cannot tell the difference between whether it's a cake or not. That is the definition of good art, even though it is imitating the modern world. I suppose instrumentalism, does it portray a message or does it have an emotional pull? I feel like are all kind of references for what makes good art. And in the process of discovering this and trying to understand what makes good art, I started looking at more artists. I came across an artist called Tommy Aquino, and I'm just going to put him up on my phone because I just need to look at it as I'm talking and sharing. But this art is one of the functions for it is its beauty. I mean, it's fine art and it's beautiful. It's got a beautiful aesthetic. It's imaginative. You can see the cubism and the inspiration, which is Pablo Picasso. I think Tommy's actually considered the Pablo Picasso of our time, which is interesting. But we can see that he's drawn from that inspiration. But what makes this art special is that it's beautiful. Good art, I suppose a form of good art, is that it's beautiful. And this piece of artwork called Mother and Child by Tommy is a beautiful piece of artwork. Or if I look at Christy and her fine art photography, she has a piece of work called Deeper Stillness. I mean, not only is it beautiful, but I think it speaks to the inner self and what we're all searching for. We're searching for, I suppose, a piece that we can't quite explain. And I think it also answers multiple questions surrounding existential crisis, what it means to have a fulfilling life, what it means to find fulfillment. And I think this piece reflects that. It reflects that there's this beauty inside of us that is stillness and silent, but it is also incredibly powerful and meaningful. Or I think of Kerry James. He has so many bold colors in his work, but then he also has these beautiful, beautiful people in his images with a beautiful black pigment, emphasizing the beauty and the power of the black person or the black diaspora. I think what's beautiful about it also is it highlights that in his world, that the central focus is that black people are beautiful, and that should not be overlooked or ignored, which can often be overlooked and ignored in other places. But he's bringing out, I suppose, parts of himself in his art, and it's also beautiful. So I suppose some of the reasons why we create is because we want to create beautiful things. We want to express something out of ourselves. We want to share a piece of ourselves with the world that maybe they would not quite be able to grasp or capture in a couple of moments with us or in a couple of seconds. But it's something that actually is quite timeless and stands the test of time. I think another thing that's quite interesting is Duchamp, which is like I'm reminded of my French university degree, interestingly enough, which I did okay, but I definitely could have done better. I also could have retained the language better, but that's a completely different conversation. Challenging culture. I think when it comes to art, one of the other reasons why we create is because we want to challenge culture. And I think Duchamp, who did his piece of artwork called The Fountain, argued that anything could be art if the artist proposed that it was art. So the concept of art is more important than art itself. I think there are some challenges to that, which I think we can go into temporarily. I suppose if everything is art, then how do we measure skill? How do we value skill or the time it takes to create something? Can anybody be an artist, or are we all intrinsically artists that I suppose operate within the world? I suppose, does it minimize the value of what we're doing? Does it minimize if somebody spends 10 hours on something and there's a particular skill which is involved, which I suppose is part of the definition of art in and of itself, then can it be considered art? But I suppose by virtue of us having the conversation and based on Duchamp proposing this as a suggestion means that the art is challenging culture, and I suppose it also implies that maybe it is valuable artwork. I suppose this is up for conversation. And I think this leads on to the conversation of why we actually create. Why do we actually create? Which is kind of the first thing that we're speaking about. We've spoken about beauty, we've spoken about challenging culture, but I think if we encompass that all into kind of one ball of what the meaning of art is, like we create for meaning. We create because we want to make some form of impact, whether that be to ourselves or to others, which then leads us on to political art. Political art challenges culture. It makes us think of different perspectives and ideas and maybe think outside of our own ideals, which is not always easy to do. I think about an artist called Faith, and she did this piece of art on race relations and on the racial injustice in America. I mean, the art in and of itself looks violent, but it also shows the challenges between how black and white people interact within the world. I think it highlights that there are some issues that need to be addressed, and maybe having art like this actually encourages us to have helpful and meaningful discussions, which then in turn means that our legislation and the way that we communicate with each other, including the culture that we're in, is better informed, and maybe also means that we live in a better world. So I suppose that's another thought. Art hopefully should make our world a better place. I think about a piece of art that I did as a poet. I did this poem about the conversation surrounding Roe v. Wade, and I did a poem on the pro-life and the pro-choice perspective and encompassed it all into one poem. My hope was to challenge culture. Whatever side you're on, why do you believe what you believe, and is there a way that we can find a middle ground so that we can essentially make the world a better and safer place for all people? One of the other reasons that we create is to talk about everyday life, or to at least express it in a way that creates meaning and also makes us think about everyday objects in a deeper and more profound way. One of the artists that communicates this really well is an artist called Tracey Emin, and she has a piece of artwork called My Bed. And if you look at the picture of this artwork, I suppose on the surface it looks quite simple. I mean, on the surface it looks like a messy room with some towels on the bed. It generally looks quite messy. There are some bottles, there's a stuffed toy, I think there's some alcohol potentially in the picture, there's some magazines, and then in the corner there is a trunk. And I think really the deeper point of this is it helps us to personify that the bed is more than just a place for sleep. It's a place of comfort, and in some way an enabler. It's the place we do our most significant things. We wake up in it and we die, but it helps to create context for what these things are for and the deeper meanings behind them. One of my favorite poets of all time is a poet called Lloyd Schwartz, and he is an American poet. He explores familial relationships, and he also talks about the confessions of everyday life. He helps us to feel more human, but he has a poem called Love, and this poem, oh my gosh, I'm pretty sure I read this poem once a month, because there is a line in it which describes the world as a coffin. When I first heard this line, I had to read it probably 4 or 5 times, because the reality is it conveys the human condition, that absence has a voice. And since the poem is about grief, it highlighted that grief is a place that if you cannot move past it, it's a place that you will live in for a very long time, and you have to find a way to manage and navigate that. The poem also talks about the importance of love, that love almost transcends the earthly context, but it goes beyond this life when it has deep and meaningful connections with a person. The other artist that I really like, who is he's essentially, what would we call him, a data-based artist? But he essentially does art based on data, and he uses AI and all these other things. His name's Rafiq Anadol, and he does some brilliant artwork. I'll put some on the screen, but essentially he uses data sets to create these beautiful 3D-like images or visuals that sit in museums and places as such. And I think essentially it almost brings the reality of where we currently are is so important, but the fact that it's being combined now with AI and data sets and computers also brings a sobering reality that we have transitioned so far now into the art world that we have to define what can be considered art and what can't be considered art. I mean, if we look at AI and we type in something, for example, I want to draw this picture or whatever the case may be, and it evokes a response, do we consider that good art because it was created by a machine, or do we accept that it is still art because the machine was created by a person and that person behind it has formulated its ability to create such art? But I want to remind us of the function of this video, what drives us to create. There are some more simple ways or reasons for why we create, and one of them is boredom. Boredom can drive art. I think for me, a lot of the time, especially when I was younger, my reason for creating art was a form of escapism. It was a form of letting go. It was a form of being able to create a world. There's a quote, I can't quite remember the details of it, but it talks about how if you, I suppose if you lived, you have lived one life, but if you read, you've lived many lives. Art has the ability of allowing people to live vicariously through it and to escape into a world that maybe they are not familiar with or cannot quite get to in the real world, which I suppose then brings in the question before, is AI considered art if it was created by a computer? I suppose perhaps. Art is also important for the sake of settling our trauma. There's a piece of artwork that I came across recently, which was by Jae-in Choi, and it's called At the Bottom of the Anxiety Swamp. And this piece of artwork looks incredibly dark. It seems like the artist is using some sort of line technique to create the piece of art, but it also almost speaks to the inner thoughts of what anxiety looks like inside. I saw another piece of artwork by an artist called Morgan Page, which was all about depersonalization, and I think it was interesting because in the picture you can see that the head is detached from the body, and she clearly communicates what depersonalization feels like through the image. I can feel connected to it in a sense that when you're, especially in the concept of trauma, that there can be that feeling of depersonalization, which many people can relate to. When I think of other reasons for art across the periods of time, I think of the Renaissance period. Like that was to provide some form of knowledge or some form of expertise. And when I go to museums, it's almost inspirational to some degree. Yes, you learn, but there's a form of sobering inspiration when you look at how somebody created something, maybe from their bare hands or using a particular technique, whatever the case may be. We have covered so many forms of art, and also why we create. And to conclude, I think we create for a number of reasons. We create because we like beautiful things. And I think that's a natural part of the human condition, that we are drawn to things that are beautiful. I mean, even if we look at Adam and Eve in the garden, there was something beautiful and enticing about engaging in something that maybe was considered in their context borderline dangerous or wrong. But because it was considered good to look at, it was considered beautiful, it felt like it was justified or it was okay. So I think one of the reasons is because we like beautiful things. I think the other reason is because we want to challenge culture. We want to have a voice, especially in the era that we are in today, post-Enlightenment. There is this desire to want to see things as signs, see things as forms of inspiration. For example, if somebody sees a shooting star, they may consider that as a form of a sign in this current era that we're in, which is post-Enlightenment. And I think art does the same. I think for some people, it can be considered a form of a sign. It's like something is speaking to me in this, and how does it sit in my body? I think we also create because we want to settle trauma. I mentioned the other piece of artwork earlier, which was about depersonalization by Morgan Page. That is a form of trauma that she is trying to settle or to heal from. So I think art in of itself is incredibly healing to ourselves, and it can be incredibly healing to others. And I think also, if we think about the advancement of AI, I think we create because we like to push the boundaries. We like to push the narrative of how far can we go? How far can this be pushed? What are the limitations of being able to create? But I think out of all of those things, I think there is an intrinsic desire to do so. Art is one form of creating or making, but each moment is about creation. And I think deep down in all of us, in some way, shape or form, while we may not all be painters or poets or do something that is what we traditionally consider art, we are all intrinsically creators and desire to create things that have meaning, whether that is creating meaningful conversations or meaningful relationships. At our core, we desire to create and we desire to do things that are meaningful. And I think art fulfills that. Thank you so much, guys, for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends or your art fellows, and I will see you in the next video.